All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome into Destination the Show, episode 36. My name is Jamie Cameron. As you can see, I am flying solo for the moment this evening without my co host, Jeremy Nygaard, who is making the world a better place, coaching some youth baseball. Thank you guys for taking the time to check out the pod. I'm going to spare any banter or ramblings from the beginning because we have a guest with us this evening who I'm really excited has found some time to chat with us about the draft and about the draft process. He is a member of the Minnesota Twins front office, and his name is Ezra Wise. Ezra is the manager of scouting research for the Minnesota Twins. Delighted to welcome him to the podcast right now. Ezra, how are you doing? And thanks so much for taking the time to join us, man.
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. Delighted to be here.
We sure appreciate it. So, Ezra, let me start here. I think that it's probably fair to say that some folks might be unfamiliar with you and your role, possibly, right? And maybe even what front offices look like beyond a few key roles when it comes to the draft. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your role with the Twins and what some of your kind of primary responsibilities are?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, my title is manager of scouting research, and what that entails is developing and maintaining um, the sort of analytics products that serve our domestic and international amateur scouting groups. And primarily, so that's sort of the high level uh, description, but our draft model, our international amateur model, those are sort of under my care, if you can
Right
call it
on.
that.
Yeah, good deal. Okay. Well, we're gonna dig into like a little bit more about kind of what your year looks like and how that process unfolds in just a minute. But I think folks might be curious, especially folks who might be unfamiliar with you, about like how you got into that role. So tell us a little bit, Ezra, if you don't mind, about your journey in the baseball industry and with the Twins. How did you get connected with the team, and what are some of the different roles that you've held prior to this point?
Yeah, so played collegiately at Macalester College in St. Paul, and then sort of I wasn't one of those people who knew exactly from the moment I sort of stepped onto campus at college that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in professional baseball. I'd say it took me some time into my senior year, maybe, where I sort of started to have an inkling that this is what I might want to do.
Mhm.
But so, uh, graduated from Macalester. For a period of time, I stuck around to coach actually too, and for a period of
Mm.
time, thought, okay, maybe coaching is sort of what I want to do. Um, but ended up the sort of foot in the door for most people is an internship. My first internship was with the Philadelphia Phillies at
Mm.
their low A affiliate um, in Lakewood, New Jersey. And in fact, that team was notable because one Williams Astudillo was on that team,
Right on.
among a slew of many more highly regarded prospects. At the time, he was just sort of breaking out, but anyway, so from the Phillies, was with the Orioles for 2 years. Um, was with MLB Advanced Media for a year. I wrote for um, Baseball Prospectus for a couple months, sort of in between. I think that was in between Orioles. Yeah, that might have been in between Orioles and no, that was in between. Um, and then in 2017, ended up back essentially where I went to college with the Minnesota Twins. And at the time, I was one of the first quantitative analysts in Twins history.
Wow.
And so it was, I don't know, exciting in a lot of ways, right? We were sort of building, not necessarily from the ground up, but there were a lot of opportunities to really get involved in sort of all parts of the organization,
Hmm.
as we were sort of building out our R&D firepower. So I started, really attending to sort of everything with the other analysts at the time. It was the two of us. So depending on what time of year it was, we would be working on whatever the most important thing was at the time, right? So whether that was draft or free agency or major league strategy stuff, it was sort of all hands on deck. And obviously we've grown considerably. Where there were two, there are now I don't know, depending on your accounting, I don't know, maybe 30 something, 40 something
Hmm.
folks in the R&D space now with the Twins. That number might be wildly off. Again, it's hard to sort of who counts and who doesn't have an explicitly technical role, but like has really strong technical skills, things of that nature.
Hmm.
But then, so I started focusing primarily on the draft starting in 2019. So that was my first year in this role. The title has changed a couple times over the years, but it's still essentially the same job. I've been doing that again since 2019, and have loved every second of it.
That's awesome. I didn't realize how extensive kind of your journey was. And sidebar, I have to imagine that prospect era Williams Dio was an entertaining player to be able to see on a daily basis.
It was incredible, and no one really knew what to do with him because he was on this team with J.P. Crawford, Carlos Tocci, Andrew Knapp. Mark Leiter Jr. was like the old college guy who no one cared about.
Right on.
But he's now pitching in high leverage for the Cubs.
Hmm.
So it was quite the collection of characters, and he was not highly regarded in any way. And he was not a priority player, in other words, but
Yep.
nonetheless was like leading the South Atlantic League in many offensive categories, and so he just sort of forced his way into like making the organization care about him. So it was really fun to watch him hit back then too.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet. For sure a unique and interesting skill set. So Ezra, we had Sean Johnson on a few weeks back, and I'm going to ask you a similar question that we had a chance to ask him at the time, because I also think this might be something that someone who's more casually interested in the MLB draft might not have a ton of insight into. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about kind of the scope of your year and what that looks like, right? So let's say day 3 of the draft is wrapped up. When we had Sean on, he was talking about, well, there's actually events that we have to cover during the draft and so on and so forth. Um, I'm really curious from your kind of unique role and vantage point in more of analytical facing position. How does your year look starting from the end of one draft cycle all the way to kind of now / the ramp up to the next one?
Sure. So I guess first things first. After day 3, take a big breath and sleep for maybe 20 hours if
There we go.
possible. Um, then honestly, for the next couple, like I won't think about anything sort of draft model development related for a couple weeks, right?
Mhm.
I'll let it breathe. There's still sort of post draft signings to worry about, so we'll sort of work through those as they come up. Um, and yeah, as Sean alluded to, I think with the way the calendar is structured now, there really isn't that much time to rest, especially with East Coast Pro area code games,
Mhm.
all the major high school events coming up not that long after the draft concludes. The Cape, the draft league, right? Like all that stuff is right. That there's no break really. So that all happens pretty quickly. We have some time to sort of catch our breath as a group, but then yeah, it's kind of on to the next cycle. From a, I guess, sort of more R&D focused side, yeah, inevitably after every cycle, you get to the point where, okay, you have to sort of stop, right? You have to stop tinkering, you have to stop experimenting, you have to stop sort of testing alternate assumptions and ways of doing things.
Mhm.
And by the end, you're like, oh man, I wish I could go back and do this, this, and that. And wouldn't it be great if we could, alter this element of the model? And so that's when I sort of start putting my ducks in the row, regarding like what improvements am I going to make, sort of into the fall, into the winter,
Mhm.
that sort of thing. Meanwhile, there's a lot of like sort of unexciting data prep and maintenance stuff that also has to go on during that time. Unfortunately, that's, I guess, the less fun part of the job. But honestly, it's something that makes much more sense to do in before we get into the spring, before we really get into okay, we've got scouts going to games, we've got games happening and data flowing in. Like we need to sort of have as much of that sort of unfun data prep and maintenance stuff squared away,
Mhm.
have as much of it done as we can going into the spring.
Yep.
So, right, we'll meet over the winter. We'll come together as a group or in person, but then also periodically over Zoom, because obviously everyone's in different places, and just put our heads together regarding like who do folks think are the sort of priority players in this class? Who are we inevitably going to be, spending the most time working
Mhm.
um, during the spring? And that, over time, that, sort of collection or the reports and sort of what we call follow list entries accumulate enough over time such that by the time we get to, November, December, like we've got a pretty hefty collection of scouting information built up,
Mhm.
and that really helps us inform sort of how we're gonna go forth, at least to start the spring, right? You come into the spring every year with this. I think this happens every year, right? This conception of what the class looks like, who the players you need to spend the most time on is, and then that gets, there's a reason they play the games, right? And then that gets thrown out of whack to varying degrees, and you adjust, right? And you follow the players we're excited about, right? That's kind of what it's all about. Um, but anyway, so I think again, sort of into the spring, I'm still sort of actively developing, making improvements, um, and sort of simultaneously communicating with everyone regarding for example, who are players we might be light on, or
Mhm.
not even necessarily light, but like, okay, we've maybe not given enough sort of in-person attention to this subset of players, or there's this guy at some weird school that doesn't often have draft prospects who might be worth checking out.
Mhm.
And then that sort of continues. We, as we get closer and closer, are sort of winnowing down that like subset of players we're really focusing heavily on. winnowing that down further and further. And then again, on the sort of more R&D oriented, like model development side, and sort of continuing that refining process. In past years, it's even been up to the very end. But that's, like I said earlier, that's that's one's natural inclination, is to like keep going until you make this thing as good as I possibly can, but at some point you've got to stop. And then let's see. Yeah, I guess that takes us up until about now. And obviously, over the past couple of years, we've had to sort of adapt to how we operate, given that the draft is pushed so far back. Right? We'd be, in years past, we'd be drafting within a month, essentially, but now it's more like 2 months. College baseball, sort of will have ended. Almost all, other than, sort of the northern states, high school seasons are over, or they're in playoffs right now. So there's much more emphasis on, summer leagues, right? Once upon a time, we weren't really able to sort of get really deep into summer league coverage leading up to the draft. But now, like I said, with the draft pushed back, it's imperative that we, continue to work, the draft league, obviously the Cape, Northwoods League, West Coast League, depending on where the player is from, they might end up in some sort of less highly trafficked league. And so that's something we have to sort of pay attention to, like tracking who's where, and again, where are pockets where we might benefit from additional coverage, additional viewings. Yeah, I guess I've been talking for a while. Anything to interject?
No, you're great. I was just that's an incredibly kind of fascinating insight, Ezra, and I thank you for it. I'm curious because you brought up the shift in the timing of the draft. Is that something that you all, as a team and as an organization, have found beneficial in terms of giving you the opportunity to collect more information, get more looks in summer leagues? Or is it challenging because it just lengthens the runway to the draft? Or is it just something different that you have to adjust to? And I'm going to add Jeremy in here too, who's going to join us. Hi, Jeremy.
Hello, Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy.
How you guys doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
How'd the game go?
So we were down, and then we were up, and then we were tied, and then now the rest of my family's getting home. But we actually won on a walk-off hit in the bottom of the seventh inning. So
there you go.
That's great. That's awesome.
And then I bailed on the field duty to get home as quick as I could. So
good job, Jeremy.
Talk some baseball stuff. So I'm gonna shut up now so we can listen to some good information.
Let's see. So yeah, I think yes, it lengthens the lead up to the draft. I think all of us would prefer, candidly, to if the draft were still in June. It just makes the sort of changeover from one class to the next a bit more challenging. I think in general, by the time we get to early June, I think we're sort of ready. I think obviously collecting more information, having more runway for players to sort of emerge and express their talent, say a small school guy or junior college player who goes to the Cape, right? There are pluses and minuses to that, right? If you've done the work on the player in the spring, all of a sudden, and there aren't that many other teams who are sort of on him or working him that hard, and he goes to the Cape and pitches well in front of pitches, or performs well offensively in front of the right people. Your whatever edge you had, sort of having been in early on the player, is eroded. So it's again, there are pluses and minuses. I think on the whole, we would prefer the draft still be in June.
Right on.
And at some point it might return to June, but like I said, like you referenced, like there are some benefits to the draft being pushed back a bit. It also means we don't get the All-Star break off, which is kind of a bummer, but that's in the grand scheme of things not that important.
I had not thought of that. That is a bummer. You guys need your time too. So, okay, Ezra, let me ask you about this, and let me give a couple of caveats before I do, right? And so, obviously, you are ramping up for this year's draft cycle. I want folks listening to know that I made it clear to Ezra prior to coming on that if there are any questions that he can only kind of talk about at a high level, that of course he's welcome to do that, right? And if there's certain questions where he can only say so much, he can only say so much. And so he always has that get out of jail free card, right? And so, Ezra, here's a question I want to ask you, right? Because you've referred to the phrase draft model a couple of times, right? And I think for draft nerds, which I think we count ourselves as, that's a term that's pretty familiar at this point, but there might be folks who are just starting to get interested or know a little bit less about the Major League Baseball draft who aren't familiar with that term. So if you can, at a high level, what is a draft model?
Sure. So I think the overall objective is to take all of the relevant sources of information that we have at our disposal, whether that's reports, draft lists, ball tracking data, performance data, sort of complementary biographical data stuff. Take all of that, synthesize it in a way that sort of rolls up to a single number that informs sort of how much we value the player. Mm-hmm. And obviously, 2017 to now, there have been year over year improvements, and our data have gotten better and cleaner, and our sort of approach to some of our modeling decisions and assumptions underlying how we go about it have changed and improved. But I think on the whole, it's still essentially the same sort of skeleton and sort of objective, right? We're trying to synthesize all of this information, learning from the past, right? And sort of formalizing how what we know in the present contributes to what that player's ultimate production is going to be. So that is sort of a draft model in a nutshell. And there are a number of different ways to sort of approach the problem. There are some teams who do it very, very similarly to us, and we might as well share a draft board with them. There are other teams who do it in a drastically different way. So it's always fun to sort of follow along, or I guess I shouldn't say fun, but more interesting to follow along sort of mid-draft and sort of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like that's consistent with their MO. But yeah, I think the goal is to sort of leverage all the information that we have on hand, and again, learning from the past and learning sort of how all those features correspond to, or have corresponded to, the future accumulation of major league value. That's sort of what it's all about.
Perfect. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I think is popular, at least as a talking point in the media, or at least with Jamie and I on Twitter, is that the Twins maybe prefer college bats, college players in general. But looking at last year, the draft was pretty heavy with prep players. Chase Petty obviously was a first round pick who was turned into Sonny Gray, who is Chase Petty's a pretty good prospect, I think, looking at. So you alluded to 2017 and on, and how those drafts have been, in my opinion, really successful. What is your approach or philosophy when you're looking at a draft class? Singularly draft class, not necessarily the big picture draft class, but like as you approach that given year, do those philosophies ever change?
Yeah, so I think we're very much aware of the like public perception that college bats has been our preference, and I guess I understand some of that given the sort of Rooker, Wallner, Larnick, that string of high picks. I think it's at this point is maybe a bit overblown, or that preference. I think the fun thing is when folks are doing mock drafts, there's a tendency by many of them to just sort of like stick us with like whoever the closest college bat, often left-handed hitting is.
Yes.
Or so I get a chuckle out of that from time to time. But I guess I assure you we are not sort of beholden to that approach. We'll select anyone in any demographic if all the stars align. We're probably not going to take any left-handed throwing high school catchers who are also relievers, but anytime soon. But I think, let's see, high school position player, college position player, high school pitcher. I've yet to participate in a draft where we took a college pitcher in the first round. Again, not by design, just more of sort of how the board aligned. But yeah, like I said, we are very much aware of that sort of perception. But no, we are, I think, open to all demographics. Again, if the stars align, if our sort of the model projects the player accordingly, as a group we feel comfortable with it, if it aligns with scouting opinion, like we'll I don't think we've ever said, oh man, we need to take a college hitter here just because that's the Twins way or something like that.
Thank you for debunking that myth. Can I drives me nuts. I have a quick follow-up here, Ezra, if you don't mind. I'm really curious the extent to which you all as a group pay attention to mock drafts, like maybe not now, but like closer, where analysts or folks in the industry might have some intel, not necessarily around the Twins and what y'all are going to do, because I think the Twins are a really tight-lipped organization. But do you pay attention to mock drafts in terms of strategy and looking at what other teams might do, or is that just a complete exercise in futility, albeit a fun one to look at?
This far out, not really. I mean, we're still far enough out that there isn't a great deal of or I shouldn't say always, but like there isn't always a great deal of credible dope, especially where we're picking this year. I think the top 10-ish is starting to, I think, form or sort of firm up a bit, and there may be some signal there. But this far out, especially around where we pick, and especially the way I think this class is materializing, we're not going to get that much of value from sort of where the mocks have, sort of the 11 to 25 range going.
Yep.
But the closer you get, when a week or 10 days out, like they usually get pretty good. And that's with, as teams are starting their meetings, and sometimes like stuff leaks out, and or the sort of public sphere writers talking to agents or whatever. Like I said, the mock drafts can get eerily good once you get really close.
Right on. That's I think kind of what we figured / have heard from other folks too. So Ezra, you brought up you talked a little bit about the model and the purpose there. We also were lucky enough to have Sean on a couple of weeks ago to talk a little bit about the scouting side. I'm really curious to hear from your perspective. How do you all as an organization kind of balance the data you have available, information you have available, analytics and scouting together? Because I think it's fair to say that the Twins have a reputation for valuing all of that and engaging in kind of a really collegial, collaborative type of process. So I'm curious how you all kind of marry and make those things work together. And then a follow up is like, has the sheer volume and prevalence of data on amateur players changed how you kind of evaluate prospects leading up to the draft?
Yeah, so I think when in sort of discussing draft models publicly, I think one of the most important bits of information that maybe tends to go overlooked is that reporting information, draftless information, that is data, right? Our sort of history of reports, our history of Prefless provides some of the most fruitful inputs, I'll say. So it's not as if there is we have like scouting reports, et cetera, and then all the performance and like ball tracking stuff on one side, and never, or like the two never meet, right? All of those sources of information are integrated and involved in the projection process. So, I think, like I said, report data is data, and very valuable data, right? I think, obviously the pre-2017 Twins were not the most sort of progressive analytically by any means. That being said, we were fortunate enough to have like a very well maintained database of scouting reports going back many decades. Obviously, that scouting system that started in the 90s looks nothing like what we have at our disposal today. But we are very fortunate to have that. Shout out to John Avenson. No chance John Avenson is listening. He's our CTO. But back in the 90s, he developed this scouting system, which was very innovative at the time. And it's been well maintained for years, sort of leading up to 2016, 2017. And again, I think there were some teams who have been, or who had been doing that sort of thing for a fairly long time. I doubt many of them, had maintained it as well as he had. So again, like I said, we're very fortunate to have that at our disposal. And again, like I said, this is all about learning from the past and being able to sort of map what we know in the present to what transpires further down the road. So again, the right sort of scouting opinion, scouting consensus, our reports are very much integrated into the process. But also, like, we get in the room, we're gonna, grind it out, if that makes sense, right? We're gonna make sure everything makes sense. If something doesn't feel right, if the player ends up in a spot on the board that again, makes us feel uncomfortable. We're going to poke and prod until, until we're blue in the face, until we, sort of collectively reach a decision regarding our tolerance for selecting the player, and whether he fits where he's at, whether it makes sense to wait. In some cases, we'll just pass. So I think it is I think you said the word collaborative. I think that's what we aspire to. We aspire to have a lot of different voices and perspectives involved in the process. And we believe that ultimately that's going to put us in the best position to make successful picks.
So what I'm going to ask, I feel like you've kind of answered this question, but I'm going to ask, I think, a little bit more specifically, because that's kind of what I do. There's been a ton of success over the recent drafts, right? Walker Jenkins has looked the part, even though he's been hurt. Brooks Lee, the same. Spencer Steer, being involved in a trade, being super successful. There's a number of examples like that were, higher picks, and then even guys that were mid to later rounds. So, the Zebby Matthews, Andrew Morris, Bailey Ober, like those type of picks that have had success over the course of 7 drafts. Is there information that you look at in the past, or like you've kind of alluded to, where you're like, yeah, we've undervalued that trait, or we've undervalued that metric, or however it works, that has caused you to refine? You mentioned like the skeleton doesn't change, but are there things, and you don't have to be super specific, obviously, but are there things that maybe you see that you kind of flag and say, okay, that's something that we need to watch more carefully? Because you've talked about, looking into the past. Is that kind of how that all works together to refine the approach as we come into 2024, knowing that there's going to be things that you learn in the next 365 days that will change your approach for 2025?
Yeah. So I think over the years, I think we've, or at least I've learned, joining the organization in 2017, that we've got incredible scouts first and foremost. And obviously, I think Jamie referenced earlier sort of the rich tradition of Twin scouting and sort of what it means to be an amateur scout for the Minnesota Twins. But I think we've learned that in general, our most successful selections have been instances where sort of the model was very much on board, scouting opinion was very much on board. We sort of met in the middle on that, on a hypothetical Venn diagram, right? And obviously, like I said, scouting opinion is very well represented in the model, in the draft model. But also, again, even after the fact, like I said, the extent to which we vet these players throughout the year, and then obviously leading up to the draft and draft meetings. I think we've, again, like I said, we found, or at least I've learned, we've got incredible scouts. I've also learned that it doesn't, I think in the moment there's this, I guess, urge or pressure to sort of pick the sort of consensus player and whatnot. It doesn't always work out like that, right? You're better off drafting the player your group really believes in, that the sort of model is supporting, than necessarily sort of conforming to the player you're supposed to take, if that makes sense. Right, like I think, like a number of teams, we're are in the moment, our drafts aren't always going to be I don't know what sort of the Monday morning quarterback approach wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, the Twins killed it here. But I think guys like Steer, Povich, Encarnacion, Strand, and then even some of the sort of lower round college pitching names. I think that's what we strive to do. I think we don't care that much about sort of public rankings and things like that. I think we're more focused on, drafting players we think, we believe in, and we believe that we can hand off to our player development folks and they can really enhance. Right. I think that's another thing we've learned over the years. We've obviously got great scouts. We have incredible player development infrastructure. And, I think it's great knowing that, once we select these players that, they're going to be in incredible hands, and that our group is going to do everything in their power to get the most out of the players, whether it's Walker Jenkins or whether it's 15th round pick Louis Varland, right? So I think that's very reassuring, and I think just speaks to the sort of caliber of people we have within this organization.
I gotta ask this question because it's always been something that I've wondered, and I've never asked anybody. But like, when you stack your draft board in any given year, and I guess it hasn't really been something that's happened recently, but if the Twins were to become a seller at a deadline, does the guy, like, is there a target of the guys that were maybe higher on the draft board? Like, if you really like someone out of high school or out of college, and then they've spent 18 months in the minors and maybe haven't had the success that you thought that they might have, are those the type of players that might be targeted in a trade, or is that just an evolving? I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for there is, but like, does that guys that you like in the draft, do they maybe stay guys that the organization keeps maybe it's a waiver claim, or you know what I mean? Like, is that something that stays pretty consistent, or is that something that really evolves a lot over time?
Yeah, so the answer is both. Like, yes, obviously, once the player gets into professional baseball, they start obviously accumulating a performance track record, and our pro scouts have at them as well. But I think particularly in the period of time between when the player is drafted and then the first sort of couple months to a year within professional baseball, in many ways, our sort of best estimate of their ability is still sort of our conception of their value as a draft. So absolutely, like, within that, especially within that first, couple, or once picks are tradable, obviously, and then within that player's first year, we're still indexing pretty heavily on, how we thought of them or how we regarded them in the draft. And same goes for international too. But yeah, I think, again, at some point, the player's body of work at the professional level is going to supersede however they were regarded in the draft, right? Like, player went in the first round, has been in professional baseball for 2 or 3 years, and hasn't done well. No amount of sort of draft love from 3 years ago might be able to sort of rescue him. But yeah, no, I think that's, I'm trying to think about, I mean, Darren Bowen's a great example from recently. He was a guy who, we were very close to selecting, and if he had hung around around longer, he would have been a Twin from Jump Street. And obviously, there weren't that many teams on him, but obviously the Mariners were another one of those teams. And then obviously when we had an opportunity to acquire Darren, we were very excited about that.
Yeah, perfect. Love it.
Okay, so Ezra, I got to ask you this, because you have spoken like a lot about, especially like right off the jump, about kind of tweaking and honing and refining like your process. And you strike me as a person who's like really kind of constantly reflecting on it and kind of striving for improvement of it. But I'm really curious how do you evaluate your process when player development can take such a long time, right? So let's say you take a guy in a draft, like it can take years before you know whether you can kind of deem that pick a success. And obviously there are different ways of kind of measuring or evaluating that, but how do you kind of navigate the need to reflect and tweak things immediately for another draft cycle with how slow of a process player development can be?
It's a great question. The the sort of hard, like the quick and dirty answer is you can't wait that long to like really start evaluating classes. So yeah, I mean, even thinking back to 17 and 18, right? That was forever ago, and players from that class, and even 2016, right? With Miranda was in that class, Griffin Jacks was in that class, right? It didn't happen overnight for them. It didn't happen overnight for Larnick. It didn't happen overnight for Brent Rooker, who's having an incredible season in Oakland right now, right? It takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. But you also can't wait that long. So, to sort of start reflecting on your recent drafts and what could have gone better, things like that. So, I think there's a simple answer, there's a more complex answer, and the more complex answer involves sort of blending observed and projected WAR to try to get a sense of how your organization's draft classes are stacking up relative to others. I guess the more sort of ad hoc back of napkin answer is, just constantly monitoring, even like very simple stuff, like how are your classes stacking up to others in even stuff as simple as strikeout rate, walk rate, FIP, WOBA, stuff that's not all that, again, just in the moment, minor league stats, early major league stats, right? Stuff like that. And then that as simple as that approach is, you start to see some trends. Who are the teams who are consistently, producing like successful minor league performers, right? So that's like the sort of simple back of napkin approach. The more complex approach is sort of blending observed and projected WAR to get a sense of how the club's picks are stacking up relative to others.
Do you ever, and I'm assuming you do, but how formal is it where you're like, how did we miss on this guy? Or what did we miss about this guy? Whether that's a Twins draft pick that, you make and then doesn't pan out, or another team's draft pick that you didn't have on your board that went higher, that starts to perform really, really well. Because I think, there's so much being a human factor in it, but when there's so much data, like you've mentioned, like how does that happen after 3 years or 5 years or whenever? Because I think that would be not necessarily the fun discussions, but the discussions that lead to the formula being tweaked, right?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical that we have that we undertake that process and sort of like be critical of our past decisions. I think there is also a danger in that, in sort of being too reactive, sort of based on in a lot of cases information that you didn't have at the time, or in fact wasn't available to anyone. So I think as long as we can look back and say our process was, sort of consistent with how we've approached, all the players we work, and, we went about it in the right way. It's hard to, or I think the tendency is to want to sort of nitpick everything and sort of be very critical. I think it's hard to do that with one-off cases, right? I think it would be more, I don't know, it's more important if, we're sort of missing on a general type of player or something like that. It's hard to really pin down, oh, we totally whiffed on this one player. We need to adjust. However, if it is sort of a larger trend, if there is a certain type of player we seem to be consistently too high or too low on, that's something we need to address and correct. But yeah, I hope I answered the question there.
For sure. I mean, because that's the hard part, right? It's overcorrecting or not correcting, and it's hard because I think the reality is they're humans, right? And so
Right.
You could do everything right and have the human element be the deciding factor of it going really well or going really, really pear-shaped. So
Yeah, I think the draft, right? Maybe I've glossed over this fact. The draft is really hard.
Right.
Draft
Absolutely.
is really hard. Especially 17 to 19-year-old high school players, and even college players with sort of incredible performance and reports and all that. Like it doesn't always work out, right? And again, like I said, if it's that we're consistently too high or too low on a certain type of player or demographic or whatever, like that's, again, cause for alarm and adjustment. But, we, I don't know, miss on a, a high performing college corner outfielder. We can't just say, oh, no, we're done with high performing
Right.
college corner outfielders, right? So yeah, I think it's really important to reflect, but also there's again danger in sort of overcorrecting or sort of correcting in the wrong ways as well.
Absolutely.
All right, Ezra, let me ask you one more question, then we'll get you out of here. This is another get out of jail free card playing opportunity if you want to take it. But I gotta ask you, if you have any kind of high level impressions of this year's class, right? I think the 2023 class was lauded as incredibly deep, not just for the top 5 players that were selected in whatever order, but also the kind of convergence of a really high performing college class and a really excellent prep class. Any high level impressions of this year's class and any particular demographics you think are interesting or kind of noteworthy this year?
I think I alluded to it earlier, just referencing sort of how much the, I guess, general public conception of this class has shifted even since sort of November or January. Right. I think the narrative back then was, oh, this class is terrible. And, the 2023 class was so good. But in reality, I think if you look at that, what I refer to as that sort of more firmed up top 10-ish, that's a really talented group of players, right? That is it's very college heavy. The college position players are mostly corner guys. That top group of pitching is very, very talented and appealing. So I think even over a couple months, the narrative has already shifted a bit. I think in general, I think our sort of in moment conception of a class quality or a given class's quality is not necessarily an exact science, right? Like think of how much things have shifted around in terms of how the 2023 class is being valued, sort of even a couple months later, right? Some of those sort of mid first round picks who were like, oh, there's this top 5, and then there's the rest of this group. Like a lot of those players are really, really good. A couple months later, and if we sort of were to redo the draft, the 2023 draft today, it would be in a vastly different order. So I think, I try not to get too caught up in assessing the present quality of the class, right? It is what we have to pick from. I'm particularly, or in general, I'd say more optimistic about the quality of this class than maybe sort of popular perception would indicate. I think, like I referenced earlier, college bats. This is a stronger catching class than last year, I'd say. I think the pitching depth is, again, up top, I guess, much stronger than I think, I think as an industry we would have sort of attributed in November or December. So yeah, there are absolutely some sort of pockets of strength demographic wise. But again, like I said, it's hard to it's hard to get too caught up in that, right? Because you still got to stack your board. You're going to draft and sign 20 something players, and again, we're gonna make the most, regardless of how the class is perceived or what the sort of actual quality is. We're gonna make the best of our picks and our pool allotment. So and again, it's we've got some additional picks this year. Obviously, picking much lower, which is where we prefer to be picking. But yeah, we're gonna get a number of players this year who Twins fans are going to be really excited about. So looking forward to that.
Awesome. Well, Ezra, you've been incredibly generous with your time and your thoughts, and we sure appreciate it. We know you're a busy man, so we will wrap it up there. Quick housekeeping notes before we finish. You guys can find us on YouTube at Destination the Show, anywhere you find your podcast. We appreciate you guys checking it out. We will be back next week to check in on some minor league standouts. Until then, enjoy the baseball. Hope the Twins can turn it around against the Yankees. See you guys next week.